When Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them came out, I enjoyed it. It wasn't the best movie I'd ever seen, but it was entertaining. Since then, I've seen plenty of ink spilled on the various aspects of the movie that didn't do it for people. But one thing I've always found weird that nobody else bothers talking about is the fact that Rowling decided to tell a political story in a country where she doesn't know anything about the government. It's hardly her greatest flaw as a writer or as a person, but it bothered me, and I think it's worth digging into. Let's start with a breakdown of the problems with how the American government is represented, because it's nuts. I would understand if this was confusing to Rowling, since New York is our largest city, and technically it was briefly our capital hundreds of years ago, and there's a chance that maybe wizards never moved their capital. The US wizards do have less contact with humans and less to do with them, but if you're going to do something like that, you actually have to do the legwork to put this kind of world building in your story. Since she didn't do any of that, it just makes her look ignorant and like she didn't do any research, and we will be continuing with the assumption that she's simply incorrect. It's also just the tip of the iceberg. The US and the UK, where Rowling lives, both have federal governments that are representative democracies. This means that national decisions are made by a council of representatives, each of whom represent an electoral district. Both of these systems are bicameral, meaning that the governing body is split into two houses, and both put the head of the majority party in charge. And that does seem to be where Rowling's understanding of the US government ends. As an American and as someone who spent a year as a literal tour guide of the US Capitol, I know a lot more about our congressional model than the UK parliamentary model, but unlike Rowling, I know how to use Google. Let's break this down. The UK Parliament has two houses, the House of Lords, which are appointed by hereditary title, and the House of Commons, which are voted in by the people. The head of this government is the Prime Minister, and they get to be the Prime Minister not through a direct vote, but by being the head of the party with the most members in elected office. We actually have something like this in the US. Congress is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and each has a leader. The House has the Speaker of the House, and the Senate has the floor leader, each of whom gets to be in their position because they're the head of the majority party. I didn't vote for Chuck Schumer to be floor leader. Actually, because I live in DC, I don't get to vote for senator at all, but if I lived in a state rather than the federal district, I would get to vote for a senator, and their party affiliation would impact which party was the majority party, and in turn, which party leader got to be the head of the Senate. Same thing on the House side. So in Fantastic Beasts, Tina, Newt, and friends go to Magical Congress, which is in New York for no reason, and run into the president. No, the president doesn't work in Congress because the president is the head of the executive branch. See, in the US, we separate our legislative and executive functions into two distinct governing bodies. This might seem strange to someone from the UK, but it seems equally as strange for an American to see the president working out of Congress. If Rowling knew anything about any of the offices held by congressional leadership, she might have had the characters run into someone like the Speaker of the House, or if she wanted them to run into the president, they could have done that somewhere else. However, there's one more thing that's weird and maybe a little less obvious. I mean, it's been obvious to me for a really long time, but it's something I've never seen anyone else bring up, so maybe it's not obvious at all. In the Harry Potter books, Harry Potter does not interact with the magical Prime Minister. He doesn't go to the magical Parliament of the United Kingdom. The UK government, in addition to Parliament, is subdivided into ministries, which are each presided over by a minister appointed by the Prime Minister. The Minister of Magic, who's the head of the wizard government, seems to be an exception to this rule, as he shows up and introduces himself to the normie non-wizard Prime Minister, but in general these are non-elected positions. From there, each ministry deals with all related national level business. Again, we have something like this in the US called departments, each of which is presided over by a secretary who's appointed by the president. This is such a direct analog. I'm honestly shocked that nobody, including Rowling herself, went for it. If Newt and Tina had rolled up to the Department of Magic and run into the Secretary of Magic, who was an elected wizard position who administered magic government in the US, that would have felt right, like these stories took place in the same universe and were being told by someone who had similar knowledge of both government systems. The Department of Magic feels appropriately American. I can imagine a gray-clad wizard with sunglasses and an earpiece going up to people's houses like, "Department of Magic, we have a warrant, open up! Alohomora! Drop your wand and put your hands in the air. Avada Kedavra, I said put your hands in the air! Maybe Newt gets to meet a native zoologist who really understands the magical creatures and the endangerment they face from modern industrialization. Maybe there's a golem in New York and there's a serious discussion about magical creatures that are made, not born. Maybe Paul Bunyan and John Henry are wizards. What we got instead is magical Congress in the wrong city where the president also works, because Rowling is a lazy writer who doesn't care and doesn't try. There are Harry Potter fans the world around, but that hasn't inspired Rowling to learn anything about them as she clumsily tries to fit their cultures, religions, histories, and governments into the systems she's most familiar with. I am well aware that as an American, I am well represented in media, including and especially political media. But this experience has given me a fresh perspective of what it's like to be misunderstood in this way. Nobody's learning about the US government from the Wizard movie written by a British woman, but there are plenty of nations whose government and cultures we do learn about primarily through media. In those cases, it's not simply a matter of scoffing at how stupid and lazy an author is, because at that point, Western chauvinistic attitudes of cultural disregard built up over a long enough timeline do build to material consequences culturally, politically, environmentally, and industrially. There's a really interesting correlation between Western imagination of a place as a real shaping force of that place, an idea pioneered by Edward Said in Orientalism, which argues that false information about a place can have dire consequences on the people of that place. And it's been fascinating to watch one of the most popular authors of all time engage in such practices in real time and be on the receiving end of it, even in this minor way. I can't claim that this has been representative of the experience of anyone living outside the US. The US is the cultural and political hegemon in a unipolar world, but it does give me a sense of how inauthentic and flimsy media feels when written by someone so ignorant of the people she's writing about, and I figured that was an experience worth sharing.